Hello, everybody. Welcome to our third podcast. It is the third podcast of the series of Introduction to International Development. And today we'll be discussing legitimacy. What is legitimacy? I'm sure many people have wondered and sometimes have said, oh, I'm not voting for this government anymore. The state is corrupt. The state did that. We have lots of questions today concerning legitimacy. And so the first question is, what is legitimacy and how have we understood it? Or how is it understood?
So a lot of my answers are going to be based on the research that I did for my PhD and that I published in a book, Reconstructing Our Understanding of State Legitimacy in Post-Conflict States. And what I was most concerned about was why in certain parts of the world people behave differently towards leaders and not in the way we expect them to. And so the first thing I did was exactly that question. What is legitimacy? And why is it important? Like, what does this really mean? And if we want to really understand what legitimacy is, we have to go back to what it means to the population. So we don't look at it just from a systems perspective. For when you look at it from a systems perspective, you try to understand how it is reflected, but we want to understand what it actually means. And when you want to understand what it means, it's really what does it mean for the population. And at the base of it, what it means is that population giving the right to whatever or whoever is legitimate to make decisions on their behalf that impact their lives without them checking on every single decision that is made. So that sort of, it's not just the faith in something, but the right for that entity or that person to make decisions that impact people's lives. And so when you look at it and understand it from that perspective, you see that it could manifest itself in different ways. And why it's important, it's because somebody is making a decision that impacts your life. And you need to understand what that means and who has that power to be able to make that decision in your life. And how does that person or that entity get that power over your life, making decisions that impact you on a daily basis.
Okay. So what are, speaking about legitimacy again, what are the sources? How do we derive legitimacy? Is it like a two-way street? Is it only one person that is given the legitimacy? How does it manifest?
There are many sources of legitimacy, but from sort of political science studies, the main ones, you could just distill it down to four main sources. One is the legitimacy that we often call process legitimacy. So that's the legitimacy associated with the type of governance system that actually exists. So just quickly to describe it, if I could, with a few words, it means pretty much democratic legitimacy. So that legitimacy through the process of the system. And if you look at how it's being measured through democratic indicators, pretty much. Then you have what we call performance legitimacy, and that's a legitimacy that you earn by meeting the basic needs of the population. And as the needs get more complex and as you meet these basic needs, then the needs transform, and then it's really harder to get that performance legitimacy. So you see more of the performance legitimacy being in cases where the basic needs need to be met and then a little bit more, but then it kind of dissipates as things get a little bit more complicated. You also have international recognition. So that's a source of legitimacy at the international level, given that we work in a Westphalian international system where the states speak on behalf of people. And so that international recognition is the recognition that you are allowed to speak on behalf of these people at the international level. And that international recognition often is provided by the UN and other multilateral institutions if you're allowed in it or not. And then there's a fourth source of the major sources. There are others as well, but the fourth of the major sources is shared beliefs, meaning that the population recognizes the right of that entity to make decisions on their behalf, and that recognizes that together they have a shared belief that this is what they want, that they believe, let's say, in what the state is, or in what the government is, or in what even the country is. And that shared belief provides that source of legitimacy to say, okay, we will follow you because you represent our country, for example, because they believe in that country.
Right. And I also see in your book you write about the fact that a country is considered legitimate when all four sources of legitimacy are complied with. So what about states that do not have one type? or what are the implications for them? Can you shed more light on this?
Well, I mean, it's at the international level, or even I would more specifically say also Western understanding of it, and those who follow Western understanding in non-Western countries. They believe that those four sources of legitimacy are necessary.
Okay.
They do believe that the primary one, which is process legitimacy, is more important than all the other sources of legitimacy.
Right.
And so in Canada, for example, we see all those four together. In England, we see all of these four together and so forth. However, it's a misconception of what is legitimate and what is not legitimate. Because again, I go back to what I said earlier about what are the indicators of legitimacy. And if your indicators of legitimacy are primarily and overwhelmingly based on process legitimacy, meaning indicators of democratic governance, that poses problems for countries that are not democratic at the base. For example, if you look at China, that's not democratic or doesn't have a democratic system as we understand it to be, along all these indicators, China is failing. China looks like it's not a legitimate country, or a state, actually. The state system is not that legitimate, or weakly legitimate.
Okay.
But from the eyes of the population, it's legitimate.
Yes.
But that shows you because they put primacy on certain types of legitimacy over other types of legitimacy, and that primacy is often, again, with what you can measure. And the indicators that we use currently are ones highly focused on process legitimacy. So the international community and also how we measure legitimacy in general, very much influenced by a sort of a monopolization, I would say, of what the definition of legitimacy is, and that conflation between democracy and legitimacy.
Okay. And so what does this mean for international development programming, for NGOs? What does it mean for international development? Tying all of this question of legitimacy, why is it even important?
I think what it means is a significant blind spot, and a significant blind spot that leads to significant negative unintended consequences. So if we know that in various countries around the world where there isn't a democratic culture per se, okay, as we understand it to be, as the indicators understand it to be, that means that in these places, that legitimacy, that source of legitimacy is lower than where it would be, for example, in Canada. We assume, because of these indicators, that there's no other legitimacy, that legitimacy is low. But if we understand it from the perspective of the population, we start to see that there is a source of legitimacy. Then when we go in and we try to prop up process legitimacy without considering the other sources of legitimacy, we don't fully understand why efforts to prop up process legitimacy get instrumentalized by the leaders so that they can prop up the legitimacy that counts more, in some cases, in these countries. So while we're trying to prop up process legitimacy, they're taking some of this money and increasing their performance legitimacy, providing these social services, saying it's coming from me, and identifying as the source of these social services to prop up their performance legitimacy. We call it corruption in the Western world. They pretty much, you could call it corruption, but it's tactical for them and it works to increase their performance legitimacy or to maintain their performance legitimacy. The other part is if we go in with NGOs, because we think the government is corrupt, and we support NGOs to provide all these services, then we also realize at that point, if we look at it from the perspective of the population, that it's the NGOs that get that legitimacy that should be accorded to the state. And then you increase the divide between the population and the state. So by focusing on a democratic governance system, by focusing on process legitimacy, we A, cause lack of legitimacy because we're not focusing on specifically what the population is looking for in many places, especially as I do look at in my book when it comes to fragile conflict affected states or states that don't have a strong relationship with the population. We're making that distance larger between the population and the state, so people no longer believe necessarily in the state. If they are involved in elections, it's to show allegiance to certain people, but not necessarily the state, not necessarily a belief in the democratic system of the state. That's why we see them not necessarily holding people to account as we expect them to hold everybody to account. They'll hold the others, but not the people they like to account, and they'll keep voting for the same people who are corrupt, who get involved in this type of activity. And then we start to realize at that point that what we're doing is we're displacing legitimacy away from the state into the hands of people that we call corrupt, or that people that are using it to improve their own legitimacy. And with time, we're destabilizing the state because we're ruining or we're negatively influencing the relationship between the state and the population.
Okay.
It's not all doom and gloom. It's not all horrible. There are variations of it. And sometimes we find people within the state that also get that legitimacy. But we absolutely need to get away from the perception and the understanding that legitimacy belongs to institutions. Clientelism belongs to people. The difference between clientelism and legitimacy is clientelism, it's a transaction. I give you, you give me in return. As I said earlier, legitimacy is, thank you, I thank you for taking care of me. And sometimes it's people they don't like, but it's the better out of the many. Now that you did this, I will allow you to make decisions on my behalf, and I won't keep checking on you and confronting you when you make decisions that I'm not fully okay with. And so the idea of imparting somebody with power to make decisions on your behalf or to make decisions that will influence you without checking them consistently, that's legitimacy. That's why it's different from clientelism. But if you look at it from the Western world point of view, it's really hard for people to understand that legitimacy can lie with individuals, with organizations, with militias, with destabilizing forces, whatever it could, private companies, whatever it could be, and it could be the actual state itself. Because in the Western world, legitimacy is imparted on state institutions and government systems. And that disconnect doesn't really help us go at the root causes of state weakness, root causes of legitimacy crises.
Right. So in your opinion, how can states be deemed more legitimate?
Well, you'd have to first look at the relationship between the state and the population.
Okay.
In many countries around the world, especially those that went through colonial times, the state was used as an apparatus to crush opposition, to hold these people separate or to hold them controlled until they got to a point, whether it's a mandate or it's an actual colonial system, until they were deemed acceptable to be part of that system. At independence, what happened was the system got transferred and given to the population. In some cases, there were adjustments that were made, in other cases minor, and in some major, and some upheavals. But what I'm trying to get to is that we rarely saw a building of state institutions or state systems that really respond to what the people wanted. And so that relationship between the people and the state never really got built.
Right.
And if you want democratic systems to function, at the primary base of a democratic system is the engagement of the populace. It's the population not only at the cyclical elections, but throughout, holding its government accountable, interacting with its government, raising issues when they don't like what's happening, sending complaints, going to the streets, whatever it is. If there is no relationship between the state and the population does not care that much or would not care and is actually more concerned with who's providing the basic services and who's taking care of them and helping them survive, because, again, that's what's important, especially if they are in such difficult situations, then what ends up happening is you don't have that base that you need to be able to hold your government to account, because you're not participating in democratic processes. And if you're not participating in democratic processes, your government doesn't have that much opposition. And that's why you see them participate in elections, wanting the people they want, regardless of what platforms these people run on. And then when the elections are over, they decide. They will follow the government if they like the guy, usually. And if they don't, they'll limit how much they want to follow the government. And again, I'm speaking in general. Again, different levels of legitimacy in different countries around the world. But I think we need to step outside this box of assuming that it's all about legitimacy of the state through democratic means, and understanding what legitimacy means for these different people and how they came to have it. And when you peel all these layers away, you realize that it's a building block. You build one on top of the other, and at the base of this building block is that relationship. And at the base of that relationship, it's not just because I believe that the state exists. At the base of that relationship is, what is that state doing for me, and how is it impacting my life? And that question is raised everywhere around the world. We don't necessarily understand it very well in Canada or don't see it because we take it as a given. but it is at the base of every relationship between people in the state. And in international development, once we get that and we understand that and we stop judging that and we stop thinking that, oh, it's because they're clientelism or they are, manipulated or brainwashed or whatever, when we truly understand the dynamics behind all of this, regardless of whether we want a democratic system or not over there, regardless whether they want a democratic system or not, when we truly understand that, we can build a strong base to then be able to build upon that base and then grow in a direction that is needed and required primarily by the population, because it's supposed to be primarily legitimate for the population and not for the Western world or for the sector of international development.
Right. So going back to your book, on page 29, you speak a lot about process legitimacy, and we see it a lot around process legitimacy related to elections, and every time it feels as if citizens or the population would wait till the next election to get rid of a government so that another one that seems more legitimate comes through, and that's a means of accountability or transparency, like you rightly mentioned in your book. So what are your thoughts? Can you shed some more light on that?
So I think we really need to understand what elections are used for. So more often than not, elections are not perceived in the same way as in the Western countries they're perceived as in elections. I'm voting for this platform, I'm voting for that platform. That's number one, especially again in conflict and post-conflict and fragile countries, or specifically also countries that where the legitimacy of the state is not that strong, or that relationship between the state and society is not that strong. But I think what we also have to understand is that idea that people see this government as legitimate because they elected this government, and this government can now start speaking on behalf of the people, I think is also very myopic in a sense, or very limited in a sense, where we assume that because they elected them into office, suddenly that this government is legitimate, or this state is legitimate and can speak on behalf of the people. But I think what we're really missing is, the can speak means, does it have the ability to speak? And can speak, does it have the authority to speak? So even if they elected it into government, or whoever the leader is, or whoever the party is, and formed the government and then led the state, the question then is, does it have the resources to be legitimate? And then does it have the okay on the part of the population to be legitimate? And those are two separate questions we have to understand. Does it have the resources and the capacity? That is influenced significantly by what we discussed in previous podcasts about the policy space.
Okay.
If the government does not have the capacity to be able to take care of the population and to actually respond to the population, because they're more responding to what is coming from the outside, so they have a very limited policy space, that election soon enough will become a hopeless exercise, because you keep bringing new ones and nothing really effectively changes. We're hoping it will change. They say it will change. They say they have a different platform, but with time it doesn't change, because again, your ability to respond to the people's needs is not necessarily there. Most people in the country would see the government as corrupt, or would see the government as not caring about them, because they're not very privy to that complexity of what's coming from the outside and what's being limited, because also states don't want to tell their population that what they can do is quite limited, because it's built on this idea of democracy and the voices of the people that carry. And so a lot of states and leaders do not admit that to the population, or the population doesn't know, and with time you start losing faith in that system. And so elections become more of elections because it's a protest vote where you don't want this person anymore, and then that's when you start seeing the swings, or it becomes a vote for something that's radically different, not because it's legitimate, but because what exists right now is not legitimate, and they don't see it as legitimate, and so we want something radically different. And that's where something like, for example, what Donald Trump would say, empty the swamp, resonates with people, because they see their government as not functioning properly and so forth. There's some questions of legitimacy around that. And again, legitimacy not from whether they went to, elect someone or to vote, but it's questions of the deeper legitimacy that we were talking about earlier. So the elections are a measure after the fact. If you see your government, or actually if you see your state as legitimate, you will participate in elections.
Yes.
If you don't see your state as legitimate, you will either not participate in elections, or you will participate in a way where it is protest, or in a way where you really want radical change, and then you start seeing the shifts. So elections really are not necessarily a measure of legitimacy if you understand the complexity of the situation around legitimacy and you don't water it down to process legitimacy and indicators of process legitimacy.
Thank you for taking care of me, but there's so much more. So we would end here, and if you do have some more questions on legitimacy, you want to engage with us, keep following us, and we have more for you. See you. Bye-bye.